And joining us now to discuss the future of Ford, Wayne Lewchuk. He's professor of labor studies and economics at McMaster University in Hamilton, and we're glad you could come into TVO tonight.
Oh, Steve.
GM and Chrysler obviously were very prominent by the fact that they did take bailout money. Ford did not. Why didn't Ford take it?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One, they were fortunate. They raised a big packet of money back in '07 when they mortgaged a lot of their assets. So they raised $20 billion before the credit crisis really hit. So they had some money in hand. And you know, they went through a bit of a restructuring a little bit earlier, so they were a bit ahead of the curve on that. And so they decided not to take the money. There's also the question of their ownership structure. I mean, it is a family-owned firm still, at least a family-controlled firm, put it that way. And bankruptcy would have changed that relationship that dates back to Henry Ford.
Well, we've got some numbers here that we want to put up, share with you and our viewers. You compare 1990 to 2008 numbers for Ford. And as we put these up, Michael, you can see Ford sales in Canada, 270,000 plus back then. Today, 208,000. The market share, 20+%, 12.5% roughly now. In the U.S., 3.2 million units way back when, down to fewer than 2 million units today. Market share of 23% back in 1990, almost 14.5% today. I mean, the numbers are all trending big time down. Given those numbers, should Ford perhaps have changed their mind and taken the bailout money?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. You know, when there's free money on the table, I mean, why not take it? Certainly Ford is not any different than Chrysler's and General Motors. They both have suffered declines in their market share, so they're all in the same game here. I think Ford was just lucky that it was in a situation where it didn't have to. Now, will there be long-term costs of this? I mean, I think that's a very interesting question.
Well, we're going to get into all that. Here's from The Economist magazine. Let me read this excerpt. Ford is still happy with its decision to avoid the government's embrace. Polls show that some 70% of taxpayers disapprove of the bailouts of GM and Chrysler. Research by Edmunds.com, an automotive website, suggests that Ford is likely to win much of the custom of those who would rather not buy a car from, quote, government motors. Moreover, if a scaled-down GM no longer floods the market with discounted vehicles, Ford should be able to raise its own prices. So the question is, how likely is it that a substantial number of people, because of their discomfort with the bailout of GM and Chrysler, might actually buy a Ford for that reason?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that's happened. It may be politics here and ideology, but I also think there's a reality that when it wasn't clear that General Motors and Chrysler were going to survive, buying a Ford was a safer bet. After all, you're buying a car that should last 4 or 5 years, and if you don't know if the other firms are going to be around in a couple of years, maybe you don't want to put your money down with those organizations. I think the other thing we have to understand is that while Ford didn't get money out of the bailout package, they got $6 billion last week out of the Advanced Manufacturing Technology Program in the States to retool their American plants. And that's again, that's a sizable amount of money. It's a loan.
Yeah, they didn't have to give up ownership stake to get that.
They didn't have to give up any loan, but they did. That is a big piece of government assistance.
Sure. Dennis DeRosier, whom you know, one of the leading consultants in the auto business in this country, he's got numbers that show Ford's USA sales went down 20.3%, while Ford's Canada sales have only decreased 5.6%. Why do you think there's a difference there?
Well, I mean, it could be a question of the product mix. I mean, I don't think anyone really completely understands these things. I think if the auto companies that understood, they would sell more cars, obviously. But certainly, maybe the product mix has done better here, and maybe some of the competitors haven't, the foreign competitors haven't penetrated the market quite as much as here. But they're certainly here in big numbers. There's no doubt about that.
More brand loyalty to Ford in Canada, is that possible?
Well,
you don't want to go that far.
I don't know if that's the case. I drive a Ford.
You drive a Ford. What do you drive?
I drive a Ford Focus.
That's their most popular car, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a biggie.
Yeah.
Ford had the best performance of the North American automakers in that U.S. Cash for Clunkers program.
Yeah.
Why did they perform so well in that?
Well, I think it's two things. I think one, as referred to earlier, it's this question that it wasn't clear that General Motors and Chrysler were going to be around. But I think secondly, Ford has got some new models that are coming out that are attractive. Chrysler's really fell behind the other companies there in designing new products, so they're in a bit of a fix. And General Motors just, they didn't have the appeal. So I think Ford was hitting on all cylinders. They had the right models, and they also had the public sympathy saying, they're going to be around. They're not taking taxpayer money, and they've really benefited from that, no doubt about it.
Well, hitting on all cylinders, except until they're now in negotiations with the Canadian Auto Workers Union.
That's right.
What are they talking about?
Well, they want the same deal that General Motors and Chrysler got. They want concessions to bring their labor costs down.
What are the prospects of that?
Well, The union is committed to pattern bargaining. Pattern bargaining is great on the way up. It's not quite so attractive on the way down, but there is a commitment to pattern. And their complaint right now is that Ford is not willing to give what Chrysler's and General Motors gave when they got their deal, which was a commitment to a minimum footprint in Canada.
Do you think there's a future for Ford production in Canada?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, I think there's a number of things.
That was a big exhale before you said yes, though.
Yes. There are a number of things that are going in our favor. We have a healthy workforce. We have a well-educated workforce. We have a good infrastructure. Ontario is a good place to build cars. The downside is, at a Canadian dollar, say that's par with the American dollars, that's problematic, to be very honest with you.
Well, we're not at par today.
But we could be at par. We're certainly a lot closer than we were, say, 5 years ago, and that is a problem, no doubt about it.
Here's from your hometown newspaper, the Hamilton Spectator. 5 years ago, 70% of Ford's U.S. sales volume was trucks and truck-based SUVs, like the Explorer and the Expedition. Today, sales figures are almost the mirror image of that. U.S. sales analyst for Ford, George Pipes, says with 64% of Fords sold in the U.S. in July being cars and car-based sports utility vehicles like the Escape. Do you think Ford can remain successful while moving away from the traditional mainstay, which has been the trucks?
Well, I think absolutely. I think you have to design the right cars. The auto industry is an industry where if you're producing at 80% capacity, you're losing money because of the economies of scale. If you can run those plants at 100% capacity, you make a lot of money. And so it's a real knife-edge problem. I think they have to get the right cars with the right design at the right price, and they'll do fine.
They had a stake in Mazda. They sold their stake in Mazda. Mazda was supposed to be one of the more innovative automakers in the world, and they've just sold. Innovation is supposed to be where it's at, and they've gotten rid of the part that was supposed to be so innovative. Was that a mistake?
Well, it certainly gave them some cash when they needed it. They've sold a controlling interest. They still have a stake in Mazda, so it's not as if they don't have an insight into what's going on there. I think Mazda was certainly important to them in the 90s in designing cars, but whether that's going to be the case going forward is a good question.
Should they have, the domestic automakers have tried to make partnerships with some of these other foreign automakers. Generally speaking, was that the right way to go when they did it?
Well, at the time, it was a quick way to get access to the in quote, secrets of what was going on in Japan. And maybe they have that now and they can move forward. But there's no doubt that they were lagging in terms of design and how to make cars in that period. And maybe now they've caught up. These new flex plants are really quite innovative in terms of getting maximum capacity out of and efficiency out of your resources.
At the beginning of 2009, Ford was reportedly $36 billion in debt.
Yeah.
How's that going to affect the company over the long term?
Well, it was reported the day before yesterday in the newspaper they've paid $10 billion of that off this quarter. So it's a good question. It's a lot of money. They also have some shortfall in their pension plan as well. But I haven't been able to substantiate this, but the report was they paid $10 billion of that off in the last quarter.
Well, you mentioned the pensions. They're $1.8 billion in shortfall in the pension plan.
Yeah. Well, $1.8 billion seems a small change when we're talking about $36 billion in other areas.
You know what? $1.8 billion still sounds like real money to me.
Yeah. Pension plans are problematic because you're trying to estimate expenses 20, 30 years down the road. And if you change the assumptions just a little bit, you can suddenly drive a healthy pension plan easily into deficit. So I think you have to be a little bit cautious there in terms of how big that problem really is.
Well, but is it still not a major problem for the Detroit Three that they have obligations to retired workers that are just, on a scale beyond all of the other automakers, and that's hurting them? There's
no doubt they have legacy costs, and they're substantial, and the transplants don't have those legacy costs, and you're absolutely right. That's an extra burden that they have to pay for. They should have funded that in advance. They didn't fund it completely, and now they've got a bit of a millstone around their neck, for sure.
Here is from Time Magazine. This piece was called, "Is This Detroit's Last Winter?" No matter what Congress or President Obama does, there is one aspect of the industry that is beyond rescue. The Detroit of the American dream, the benevolent manufacturing state, the big metal, big labor, big brother, bigger than its britches Detroit, is deader than Studebaker. You agree with that?
No.
No?
No. The big three were counted out in the early 80s, and they came back with a vengeance. It's not clear that they're out. It may be the case that less of this production is going to be done in North America, but Ford just announced the construction of a new flex plant in China. So China and India are becoming big markets for these companies, and I think it's too early to count them out.
You've mentioned flex plant a couple of times. You just want to explain what that means?
Yeah, a flex plant is a plant where you can produce more than one model at the same time. So in the 80s and the 90s, there was a big rush to produce plants that specialize in only one kind of car. And the problem was, if that car or truck didn't sell, then what are you going to do with that plant? In a flex plant, you can run a car, maybe a truck or a small car down exactly the same line, and the equipment can adapt to making more than one vehicle. So that means if one vehicle is not selling, you simply ramp up production of the vehicle that is selling, and so you can get 100% capacity out of your plants.
Can you anticipate them bringing their European models to North America?
Well, that was supposed to be the case with the Focus. I think there's a fair amount of sharing, but they are somewhat different markets. You have different gas prices, you have different road structures and whatnot, and so they're not exactly the same markets.
Some people are speculating, though, that one of those Detroit three isn't going to make it.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
They've been speculating that for a long time, so
I'm
not convinced.
You're quite bullish on this business, eh? You're the one.
I grew up in Windsor.
You go.
I've seen 50 years of this up and down, and I think it's way too early to count them out.
Do you think Ford stands a better chance of being at the finish line, wherever that finish line is, than GM or Chrysler?
Mm-hmm. Again, I think it's hard to guess who is most likely to win here. Ford has some assets now that are valuable. Chrysler's hooking up with Fiat. Certainly is an advantage for it. General Motors is big. That may be an advantage. So they each have some advantages. I just think it's too early to count any of them out.
Could you have imagined when you were growing up in Windsor that the state of the North American auto business would be where it is today? I mean, this is pretty awful today, isn't it?
This is a tough industry. Everyone points to Honda and Toyota as these great success stories, but again, if you'd been an investor in those companies, you wouldn't have made a lot of money. It's a tough, competitive industry, and always has been. Has its ups and its downs. I can remember as a young guy in Windsor, they shut down car production at Ford's, and they moved to Oakville, and everyone said, "Well, that's the end of that." Well, they've been producing engines there for 40 years. This is a hard business, and it's not clear that it's time to write anybody out.
Okay. Wayne Lewchuk, thanks for coming in from McMaster University tonight. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.